Hi, this is Dr. Gordo, and welcome to the Raven and the Writing Desk. We have an extra special video today, Verbs Galore. This is part of our 8-part series on the parts of language, and arguably, verbs are the most important parts of speech. They are the backbone of language. They are action words. If you can master the verbs of a foreign language without knowing any other words, I mean, obviously this is an oversimplification, but you could do well to be understood if you only know verbs. And that certainly applies to English as well. So if you're an English language learner, learn your verbs. And if you're watching this channel because you want to become a better writer, knowing how to use verbs to the best of their ability, and of course, widening your vocabulary is going to make you a better writer. So let's get into this. So actions can be material or immaterial. I walk, I think. One can be demonstrated just by seeing it, and then the other one, when you're dealing with things that are non-matter, such as thinking and thoughts, again, it's a concept that is understood. The good news is whether the verb is material or immaterial does not impact its spelling or the way you pronounce it. Now, on a side note, I should say in English, we form the infinitive by adding to in front of the verb. In other languages that I'm familiar with, the infinitive is a word in itself. It's the verb in its simplest form, meaning in order to action. In English, technically the infinitive is actually one word. Even though to is a word, walk is a word, to walk is considered a word. The kicker, though, is the infinitive is actually acting like a noun. So I'm going to get into the infinitive a little later in the conversation. The reason why I mention it here is quite often when you see a verb in English, they'll demonstrate it as the infinitive for reasons we don't really need to get into. But to walk, it's all about the action of walking. To think is all about the action of thinking. Verbs will team up with a noun or pronoun to form a subject. For example, Jesus wept. I use that example because it came to mind. It's the shortest verse in the Bible. John 11:35, Jesus wept. Jesus is the noun. Wept, to cry, is the verb. So noun plus verb, you've got a subject. And in this case here, you've got an independent clause. You have a complete thought. Jesus wept. Jesus cried. Now, I think a good place to begin is to talk about the 12 different verb tenses in English. That sounds like a lot, but it's actually divided into a chart of whether the action is taking place in the present, the past, or the future. And not to get too philosophical, but that it's always the state of things. That it's always today. It's always the present. It's never yesterday, and it's never tomorrow. We talk about the past and the future in philosophical terms. Again, not to get too deep into it, but to be aware of this fact, to be aware of these concepts, is to set yourself up for success when it comes to using verbs properly. Is the action taking place now? Has the action already taken place? Or is it going to take place in the future? In addition, is the action completed, ongoing, or yet to start? With all this in mind, let's get into the 12 verb tenses, and I'm using the example to walk. First up, we have the simple tense, and it's called simple because it's straightforward. So in the present tense, and I'm using the first person pronoun I walk. Past, I walked. Future, I will walk. So as we can see here, for the present tense, we take the infinitive and we just simply put our pronoun in front. In this case, I'm referring to myself. It's I walk. To form the past tense, I just add ed to walk to form walked, and I got the past tense. I walked. Whether it was yesterday or last year, it doesn't matter. I walked. Now, when I'm done this presentation, I'm going to be going for a walk. And so I will walk when I'm done with this recording. In passing, I just want you to be aware, if you're not aware already, that English, like many languages, full of irregular verbs. They do not follow a consistent form of spelling. The bad news is you simply have to learn them. You just need to practice your English, practice your writing as you learn all the different irregular verbs. So one irregular one here, it's to write. So I write, and in the future, I will write, easy enough. But the past tense is I wrote instead of I righted. It's I wrote. This is also an example of a strong verb. Don't need to get too much into that detail, but whenever you see the verb, the past tense verb with an O in there, it's going to be a strong verb. Good to know if you're a writer. And really all you need to worry about here is spelling and consistency. Because I got to tell you, if I'm talking to someone and they were to say, so I righted a note for my teacher, it's completely incorrect, but I still understand the person because they're being consistent with their pronoun, all the information. They've just simply said it righted instead of wrote. So there's the good news here. Be consistent, take an educated guess, and if you're wrong, you're wrong. You learn something. And in the meantime, just be positive and focus on learning your irregular verbs. However it is that you learn. Do you write it down? Do you give yourself some flashcards? You think about how you're going to keep track of all these irregular verbs. And let's move on to the next slide. So I can do a quick note on pronunciation. I've learned this from being an English language teacher, is when learners see that ed at the end of the word, and without getting too much detail, syllables have a vowel sound in it, the learner wants to stress that ed. So instead of saying I walked, they say I walked it to the store. And so you got to point out to people that, okay, it's a light touch. It's more of a t than anything. I walked to the store. Unfortunately, I can't do a universal on this because if the preceding syllable ends in a D or a T sound, like to divide, okay, I've already done it. I've divided. The Leaning Tower of Pisa, it tilts. It's a tilted tower. In those cases, we're doing the extra stress on the ED simply because we already had a D sound in there, so we need to make sure that it's heard. Otherwise, just lightly touch that ED. Walk, walked. Moving on to the next verb form, let's take a look at what's called the progressive. The progressive focuses on an occurring action. I am walking. So I'm in the state of walking right now. Yesterday, something happened when I was walking. And in the future, again, I will be walking once I'm done this recording. And so you can probably see already we're taking the infinitive. we're conjugating it into whatever it needs to do to match the pronoun. So I walked, he walks, so forth. We conjugate the verb to be first. So I am, I was, I will be. Then we add in the verb, and then we add ing to the verb form. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any crazy spellings you should need to be aware of. So you're adding ing to the verb, and then putting the conjugated form of I am in front of it to form the progressive. I am walking, I was walking, I will be walking. Now we're getting into a little trickier of a tense. It's an odd name. It's called the perfect. In grammar, perfect means completed. And for those who know English, you're probably thinking, okay, so if I wrote a test and the teacher said, the test is perfect. In a sense, they're saying the test is complete. There's no further information that needs to be added to make this test any better. It's perfect the way it is. It's complete. We form the perfect in English to describe a completed action, and we do this because we really want the audience to focus on that completed action. I have walked. I had walked. I will have walked. There's some other information going on here that I want the audience to focus on the fact that I completed this task of walking. Because even in the present tense, it's like, I have walked these streets for years, and wow, the houses are starting to look sad. We form the perfect by taking the infinitive to have, conjugating it to match the pronoun, and then we take the verb and we add ed to the end. So this is tricky because even in the present tense, we're talking about a completed task, something that was just completed. And there's something about that completed action that we want to draw the audience attention to. It's something that as you use more in your everyday speech, it begins to make more sense. In the meantime, let's move on to our final verb tense. And you can maybe see it coming. It's the perfect progressive. The focus is on the result of an occurring action. So we're really getting conceptual here. We're going to take the verb to have and conjugate it. We're going to add in the verb been. Then we're going to add in our infinitive. Then we're going to add ing to that conjugated infinitive. The result being, I have been walking. I had been walking. I will have been walking. So for that last example, by 6 o'clock tonight, I will have been walking 2 hours. I had been walking for days. I have been walking these streets for a while now. And again, you're setting up another idea here. We're just looking at the actual function of the different verb tenses. So, to quickly recap, look at the action. When is the action happening? Present, past, future. Is the action still occurring, or has the action completed? And what is the focus of the sentence? Do you wish to draw the reader or the audience's attention to the person in that sentence? Do you wish to draw attention to the actual action? This is what the linguist Michel Thomas, he does wonderful tapes on learning the Romance languages. He talks about a heightened sense, a heightened awareness of language. What exactly is it that you're trying to communicate? That is when you're choosing the finer words. Now, for someone who's listening to these videos because you want to become a better writer, this is something you're going to think a lot about. You're going to reflect a lot. If you're an English language learner, you're going to trip yourself up overthinking exactly what it is that you're trying to say. That is where you need to be less afraid to make mistakes and just take your educated guess. Just blurt it out. And again, if it's wrong, well, then you learn from it. And if it's correct, congratulations, you're learning. The main takeaway is, if the subject is clear, the idea is probably going to be understood. And if you're an English language learner, just use simple words. Just use the simple verb tense until you become more comfortable with the progressive or the perfect. And you can also use other words in your sentence as road signs for the audience to help them understand what is it you're talking about. So for example, this isn't great English, but if I was to say, I go now to the store, what is that I'm communicating? I'm clearly indicating that I'm going to the store right now. If I was to say, I go tomorrow to the store, again, it doesn't sound that great in English, but the idea is clearly understood. Tomorrow, I'm going to go to the store. And if I was to say, yesterday, I go to the store, and again, not great English, it should be, I went to the store. But by saying, yesterday I go, I'm setting myself up for success. I'm giving the road signs to the audience of where I'm going with my ideas. So don't overthink it. Just do it. So let's do it then. How are we going to use verbs? Verbs cover all states of being. I went over this when I was talking about material and immaterial. Sometimes verbs are going to be dynamic. Something is happening. Again, you're talking about action that is occurring. Something is happening. It looks like it's changing. We also use verbs to talk about static states of being. One thing I hear quite a bit on some of the channels that I'm on, Peter Parker is Spider-Man, Myles Morales is Myles Morales. Peter Parker is Spider-Man. He's always going to be Spider-Man. As opposed to Myles Morales. Myles Morales, he's awesome. He's a great Myles Morales. He's always going to be Myles Morales. And in both cases here, whether we were talking about a dynamic action or a static or fixed action, we're using the exact same verb in the exact same form. We're pronouncing it the same way. So again, I'd like to emphasize the good news that sometimes when English is consistent, boy, does it just make sense. You're going to be using verbs a lot as what are called auxiliary or helping verbs. Quite often, we're going to see it with the verb to be. Again, is a great example of a conjugated form of to be. To have, and to do. These are all important linking verbs because, wow, we use them a lot in English. And once you actually become aware that to be, to have, to do, between all 12 tenses, there's 36 words right there. And we use them a lot to describe our everyday activity. So, honest, good advice to you. If you do not know it already, know to be, to have, to do in all 12 tenses. And if you're an English language learner, you'll have a lot of choice in expressing ideas. Now, that said about English language learners, they get quite tripped up with the concept in English of to have, because in English, the same words can have multiple meanings. And to have can mean to possess, to own something, but it can also be to consume. So I'm going to have dinner. Oh, what did you drink? Oh, I had a Coca-Cola. I just had some water. So we have a curious expression in English, to have his cake and eat it too. People are like, well, if you're having cake, Well, if you're having cake, aren't you eating it? Isn't that like an oxymoron? No, no, no. He's talking about one cannot possess a cake and eat it. Either you have this big, beautiful cake to look at, or you eat it. You can't have both. Likewise, in English, wow do we use to do a lot. To do means to make something. It could mean to work on something. It could also mean to complete an action. I will do it later. I did it already. Do you want to go? I'm doing it tomorrow. All of these different ideas are being expressed even though they're all using the same verb. So again, learning to do. Better be on your to-do list. And once you're done that, here are all the auxiliaries. Be, can, could, dare, do, have, may, might, must, need, ought, shall, should, will, and would. Let's talk a little bit more about these auxiliaries. In regards to modality, again, English teacher term, you don't need to know. It's talking about could, should, must, as well as the adverbs possibly or necessarily. How urgent is the action? And is there an option whether we need to do that action or not? So, may I go to the washroom? Is what you should say if you're asking for permission to go to the washroom. So quite often with students, they'll say, oh, may I go to the washroom? Or more likely, students are going to ask, can I go to the washroom? Which creates the old English joke, I don't know, can you? Because can talks about ability. If you're asking me, can I go to the washroom? Well, I don't know, can you? Because technically you're asking me ability. I will say this. In everyday speech, there's no difference between may and can. People use them interchangeably. So if a student asks me, can I go to the washroom? I'm not going to make that joke about, oh, I don't know, can you? I'm going to say, yeah, sure. Maybe they need to sign out, something like that. What's more interesting are words like must, shall, and should. If you must do something, that means there's no other action. Hey, I must go to the washroom right now. As in, I don't care if you say no, I'm leaving. I'm going. I have to do this. You'll also see the term shall, particularly in legal paperwork. Shall is the fancy way of saying must. If someone says, you shall surrender your driver's license, that means you just lost your driver's license. You have no option here. As opposed to the word should, it suggests an obligation that is at least somewhat voluntary. It's like, well, I should go to bed right now. It's getting late. Well, yeah, if it's getting late, you probably should go, but I have the option of staying up later. So for modality, knowing the difference between may, can, must, shall, should when they're teaming up with verbs gives you that extra dimension of meaning. Let's continue. Phrasal verbs. A phrasal verb is when we have a verb and then we team it up with an adverb or a preposition to form a new word. If you're not familiar with prepositions, watch our video on it. A preposition is the position of something. So the pen is on the desk. There's a garbage can underneath the desk. There is a chair beside the desk, and so forth. Where is one object in position to another? We do this a lot in English. The one example I have here is if you take the word to work. To work means to do your job or to solve something. If we add in the preposition out and form the new phrase to work out, that usually means exercise. I'm going to the gym to work out. When I was living in Sweden, I noticed a lot of people said train. Yeah, I'm going to the gym to train. But at least here in Canada, we say I'm going to work out at the gym. To work out can also mean to solve something. So the students worked out a problem. Forming these phrasal verbs is more of a matter of just learning them. Even if you were to look up a list of English phrasal verbs and memorize them, not necessarily a bad idea. Or if you're a teacher, it's a good idea to form some lessons on those, because we do use phrasal verbs a lot in English. When it comes to setting them up, matching them up with your pronoun, just use your tense rules. The preposition itself never changes. For example, I had been working out when something happened. The students are going to be solving the problem. Oh, sorry, I meant to say the students are going to be working out the problem. Are going to work out the problem, sorry. That's the fault of my slide there. And that's all I'm going to say about phrasal verbs. I could create a whole video on them alone, so if you're interested in more about this, just let me know down in the comments. That's a video I could throw together. Otherwise, I'd like to start to wrap up this video. English teachers in the audience, you're going to want to know the difference between transitive, intransitive, and ditransitive verbs. They are all just fancy titles for what is the verb doing with an object or to an object in the sentence. This is good for English language learners to show how stable an English sentence can be. So I put together the sentence, Thornton passed the puck to the goalie. If you do not know hockey, that may have sounded like gibberish to you. But the good news is, in English, look at how we're going to set up the noun and the verb to form a subject. So Thornton passed. I could just make up words right now like digimity, dist. Like, what the heck does that mean? You know it means something because the noun is followed by a verb, and you're recognizing it as a verb because it's ending in ed. I've seen this done before, that people can just make up gibberish words, but as long as there's certain things that are consistent, like the past tense of the verb ending in ed, people are going to be able to take an educated guess at what is going on. So back to this sentence. Thornton passed the puck to the goalie. In this case here, the puck is the direct object because Thornton, who is the subject, is doing something with it. And what's he doing with it? He's sending it off to another object in the sentence, which makes it the indirect object. In this case, the goalie is the indirect object. So a direct object is the noun or pronoun receiving the action. And if the noun or pronoun is receiving the object from the direct object, that's an indirect object. Again, I don't like these explanations that much because they sound more complicated than they need to be. There's only a few people listening to this who actually want to know the ins and outs of the technical terms, but when we're talking about this, it is good to use the terms so that you can take ownership of something when you know it. Getting back to transitive, intransitive, and detransitive verbs. If a verb is transitive, that means no object is needed for meaning to be understood. So in the sentence, Thornton passed, it's actually a sad sentence because in English, if somebody dies, a euphemism is we say that they've passed. Thornton passed. Thornton died. There's no object needed because the thought is complete. But in this case here, we're not talking about someone dying. We're talking about playing hockey here. So we need a transitive verb in here. We need a direct object. Thornton passed the puck. Complete idea. We have a subject, and that subject is doing something with a direct object. A detransitive verb is one that can take on a direct object or an indirect object. So in this case here, to the goalie. that makes the past become a detransitive verb. And again, you do not need to know these labels unless you're an English teacher. But if you're an English language learner, take heart in the idea that, wow, noun, verb, direct object, I got a complete idea. If you're matching your nouns up with a verb and you're being consistent with it, you're going to be understood as you build your knowledge of the English language and you build your confidence. Finally, I'm going to go over this quickly, linking verbs. We talk about linking verbs a lot in these videos because they're vital to complete ideas, particularly when we're talking about dependent clauses, and more information is needed for the thought to make sense. So, he is a YouTuber. In this case, is acting as a linking verb, connecting the pronoun he to, well, what is he? What does he do? Oh, he's a YouTuber. Also be familiar with the verb to become. He is becoming a YouTuber is different, slightly different than he is a YouTuber. So linking verbs are simply used to use a verb to attach more information onto an existing idea or to set up a new idea. It's one of those things that we use them all the time, and in fact, to give them the label makes them a little more complicated than they need to be. So the good news is just use verbs the way they've been explained in this video, and you're probably going to be successful with no idea of what the names of the different labels are. If you know how to use them, and your goal is to know how to use them, congratulations. And if you're an English teacher and you're just gathering information for a lesson, well, watch the video again. Watch it a couple times. And please, ask me any questions and I'll get back to you. So, one last idea before we wrap up, and it has to do with something called gerunds. This is when we get into using verbs as nouns. I mentioned that earlier, that infinitives are actually nouns. Gerunds, you add ing to the verb itself, and the focus of the word becomes the verb as an event. We try to avoid fighting. In this case here, fighting is not a verb. It's a noun. We're trying to avoid this person, place, or thing. And that thing is fighting. So notice that the gerund doesn't have a noun or a pronoun with it to make sense because it's a noun in itself. Again, just something I wanted to squeeze in here at the end of the presentation. To recap, verbs are the most important part of language, so be familiar with it. English has 12 verb tenses. Be familiar with them. Simple, perfect, progressive, perfect, progressive. Know how to use to be, to have, and to do, along with their modality. That's what you should, must, may, can. You'll be able to communicate a lot of complex ideas and a lot of simple ideas at that. So note how verbs interact with direct and indirect objects in sentences to form ideas. And finally, verbs can be nouns, gerunds, or infinitives. And I see I spelled infinitives wrong there. So next up, be sure to check out our videos on nouns and pronouns. They're part of our Parts of Speech series. And in the meantime, like, subscribe, and please ask your questions in the comments, and I'll do my best to get back to you as quickly as possible. So I thank you for watching this video, and have a great day.